Manchester United have just signed Mason Mount for a fee that could go up to £60 million. And when you spend that amount of money on a player, you have to be sure as hell that they're going to fit in somewhere. So where is he going to fit into Manchester United? Well, fortunately, we've got a really good article looking at just this on The Athletic from Laurie Whitwell and Tom Harris. And they write that Mason Mount has played predominantly as a number 10, which is the role mainly occupied by Bruno Fernandes, but also at times last season by Wout Weghorst. Now, obviously, Mount offers a much better fit when Ten Hag opts to shift Fernandes to the wing or rest him. So there is the possibility of playing him here, but this already doesn't make the Mount signing seem particularly ideal. But there is more, because Mason Mount can also play deeper, and signing a mobile number 8 has been on United's wish list. Christian Eriksen enjoyed a good season after signing on a free transfer, but tended to tire in games, whereas Mount would be expected to maintain his energy for the full match. So it looks as though Mason Mount is going to predominantly play as an 8, but who can fit in as a 10 when Bruno Fernandes isn't available. And that raises the question, can Mason Mount play as a mobile number 8? So let's just think about what it is that Christian Eriksen does for Manchester United. So here's Manchester United's starting 11 from last season. And what I always like to do with Manchester United is divide the team into 2 units. So you have an attacking unit up here. Their job is to pick the ball up in the opposition half and generate chances. And then you have this deeper lying unit, and their job is to defend, obviously stop the opposition from scoring, but also they're expected to move the ball down the field so that the attacking unit can generate goals and score. Now, Christian Eriksen sits as a bit of a hybrid player between these 2 units, because on the one hand, you're expecting him to get down the field, help out to generate chances and also box crash himself, but also there's going to be situations where he can drop in, help out in the build-up and also help out defensively as well. So what we're looking for in a mobile number 8 in the Manchester United mould is a player who can do both of these things, get forward and drop in. Now, obviously Mason Mount is really adept at the attacking side of this role. As we've already said, he's predominantly a number 10, and what he likes to do is get in between the lines and operate as a link player between the midfield and the attack, generating chances for his team. So there's no worries here, and I've just got a couple of screenshots to show how he might do this for Manchester United. So this is a game against Brentford last season, and as we can see, here's Mason Mount. He's operating on the outside of a midfield 3. We've got Jorginho as a pivot and then Kovacic next to him. And here we can see Mason Mount dropping out into this pocket of space that's opened up on the left-hand side of the pitch. This is the sort of area where we'd expect Christian Eriksen to be playing, and in doing so, he allows his team to be able to manipulate the opposition and generate space. So you can see he's picked up the ball here, he's pulled Mads Roerslev towards him, and in so doing, he's opened up space in this area for Cucurella to pull wide, take the defender with him and generate a lot of space now around Kai Havertz here. Now, if we move the tape onwards a little bit, we can see that now Mount has the ball in space, he has a lot of players around him, he actually has quite an easy pass here to Jorginho, who really wants the ball to feet here, and the idea would be play the ball to Jorginho and he can slip Kai Havertz in, but actually Mason Mount sees the space that has been generated here, and he's actually able to play the pass into the feet of Kai Havertz, who can then turn and have a chance. So this is the sort of thing that we would want to see him doing if he played for Manchester United, generating space and then being able to manipulate the space that he's generated. So he'd be perfect in this sort of role for Manchester United. And then in terms of the box crashing element, we can see that Mason Mount is really happy to get forward into the penalty area, take shots and score as well. And in his time at Chelsea, since he debuted, he's actually the highest scorer for Chelsea in that period. It's also worth noting that Eriksen is Manchester United's set-piece taker, and Mount has also been Chelsea's set-piece taker as well. And so that's another area where this makes sense from a recruitment point of view. So in terms of the attacking side of the game, there's no worries whatsoever about Mason Mount playing for Manchester United in this mobile 8 position. But what about the other side of this role? What about the moments when Christian Eriksen is expected to drop into this deeper unit of players, help them to possess the ball, and then progress the ball down the field to this unit of attacking players? Now, at this point, we need to talk about pivot players, because when you're playing with a defensive midfielder, usually what will happen in the build-up is that that player will become a pivot player. And what we mean by that is that they're usually the focal point of a team's deep build-up. And what they're going to do is they're going to show for short passes to allow a team to play around an opposition press. But also what they can do is pull opposition players away from the ball and generate space then that can be exploited by the team who are in build-up. And when this happens, what you'll usually see is one of the 8s dropping in to form what we would call a situational pivot. And so what we might see here then is Eriksen as one of the 8s dropping in to form a situational pivot with Casemiro, who's pulled the opposition player away and generated the space that the ball can be played into. Now, this is something that Manchester United do quite a lot. So here's just an example of that from a game against Aston Villa. This is Manchester United's back 4. And as you can see, they pulled right round across the pitch. And then we have Casemiro, who's the defensive midfielder, and he's playing as a pivot here. So he's the link player now for all of these defenders in the build-up phase. Now, if we move the tape on, what we can see here is that Christian Eriksen has dropped in to form that situational pivot to help out in the build-up. Luke Shaw can just play the ball into him, and he's going to play a bounce pass to Casemiro. And so what Manchester United have done then is play the ball around that first line of the Villa press into the feet of Casemiro, and then they can move further down the field from that point. Now, if you watch almost any game with Mount in, then you'll see this sort of action happening all the time. So here's an example from a game against Crystal Palace last season. So what's going to happen is Thiago Silva's going to play the ball into the feet of Mount. He's dropping in, he's going to pull Michael Olise across to him, and then he can play the bounce pass to Kovacic here. And again, what you've done is you played around that forward line of the opposition press, and then you're ready to progress the ball down the field. But it's also worth noting that Mount isn't always going to pass in these situations, because one of the things that he is best at is receiving the ball, turning on the ball, and then having his body facing the opposition goal and then being able to carry it towards that back line. So in this instance, he receives the ball from Koulibaly, and then rather than passing back to Chalobah here, he actually takes the ball really nicely on his back foot so that he can actually play the ball with a positive touch forward and then turn and carry the ball forward. And in this respect, he actually offers a lot more upside than someone like Christian Eriksen as well. So this is going to add something to Manchester United's mobile 8 play, which is ball carrying in the midfield area as well. But Manchester United don't always play with Casemiro as a single pivot. In fact, in some games, they have the flexibility to move Christian Eriksen alongside him and then form a double pivot here. So now you have two players in the build-up who are going to play that pivot role. And the reason that you would do that is because it gives you an extra player in the build-up phase. So if the opposition are being particularly aggressive in their press when you're doing a deep build-up, it just gives you another player here who can help out. But interestingly enough, sometimes in these situations, Manchester United will move Casemiro forward. That's usually because they want Eriksen to do the deep line playmaker stuff more than they want Casemiro to do it. They're going to do this in particular when the opposition are quite heavy pressing, because Eriksen is more press resistant than Casemiro. So this is what it looks like in practice. This is Manchester United playing against West Ham, and as we can see, here's the back four, and we've got Eriksen now on the ball playing as that pivot player, and rather than having Casemiro alongside him as a double pivot, he's moved up into the midfield area. So this raises a further question about Mason Mount's ability to fit into this role for Manchester United, because we quite simply don't have a huge amount of evidence that he can play in this way as a deep line playmaker. Now, I have trawled through the archives and I did come across this game. Now, this is the last game that Thomas Tuchel managed Chelsea for. This is a game against Dinamo Zagreb, and Chelsea are playing in a 3-4-3 shape with Mason Mount as one of the two midfielders alongside Kovacic. And so essentially what this means is that in deeper build-up moments, you have a de facto double pivot of Kovacic and Mount, and you can see Mount here on the ball just helping in the build-up zone. But actually, even in this game, most of the time you're seeing Kovacic drop as the pivot player and Mount moving further down the field, because that's just what suits their particular roles and skill sets. So we still don't have a huge amount of evidence for how well Mason Mount will be able to play in this deeper lying playmaker role. But that's the thing about assessing a player for a specific role, because there's two different types of evidence here. On the one hand, we have first order evidence, and that is examples of a player doing exactly what it is that you want them to do on the pitch. We've already seen Mason Mount doing that when he drops in as a situational pivot. But there's also a second order of evidence that we can use to assess a player, and that is taking things that they're doing elsewhere on the pitch and using that as an example for why they might be able to play a different role. So for example, in assessing Mason Mount's fit as a deep line playmaker, we could take a look at his passing sonar. So this viz shows the directions that Mason Mount likes to take his passes in. What we need to do is imagine Mason Mount standing in the middle of this circle, facing this way, and these are the direction that his passes are going in. And as you can see, he has the ability to play passes in every direction. He has a slight tendency to play towards the right because he is right-footed, and this would suggest that if Mount does drop into those deeper areas, he would have the ability to play those passes forward. But we do need to caveat this, because there is a difference between playing these sorts of passes further up the pitch, which is where Mason Mount usually is, and then playing them in a deeper position, because further up the pitch, Mount has the ability to be fairly risky. He's a creative player. He can make passes that might not always come off, whereas if you're playing deeper in the field, if you make those passes that go wrong, you end up with situations like Manchester United ended up with at the beginning of last season, and that is not a good thing. So is Mason Mount actually ideal for Manchester United? Because so far what we've said is he plays best as a number 10, but Manchester United have one of their better players in the 10 position already, and he can play as an 8, but he's not the perfect replacement for Christian Eriksen. There's things that he does better, but there are also things that he does worse. Now, it is worth saying that we are speculating on what it is that Erik ten Hag is doing next season. It could be the case that he's just going to move to a system where they're usually using Casemiro as a single pivot, and Mason Mount doesn't have to drop in as that double pivot very often. But Erik ten Hag is all about flexibility, and that sort of approach would seem to be reducing the possibilities open to him, so I think it's fairly unlikely. And of course, we could just see a rotation between Mount and Eriksen, depending on what Erik ten Hag wanted in those deeper build-up phases. But £60 million is a lot of money for a player who's a backup in one position and then a rotation option in the other position. So is Mason Mount actually ideal for Manchester United? Well, asking the question in that way presupposes that when we're looking to recruit players, what we're looking for is a one-to-one mapping across different positions. So if we want to replace Christian Eriksen, we just have to find another younger version of Christian Eriksen. And that is not what is actually happening here. Perhaps Mason Mount has been brought in to solve a very different problem. And this was the problem that Manchester United struggled with the whole of last season, and that was the availability of their starting 11. So on the board in front of me here, I've got the best starting 11 that Manchester United had last season, and then the viz here just shows whether or not they started in these games all the way through the Premier League. So if there's a red mark, that means that that player did not start in that game. And as you can see here, there is not a single game week in the Premier League where Manchester United's best 11 was available to start. Now, if we look at the centre midfield area in particular, so we've got Casemiro and Eriksen here, there's another argument for why Mason Mount might not be the ideal Eriksen replacement, because surely if you wanted a smart backup in the midfield area, you'd want to find someone who could replace Eriksen when he wasn't available, and someone who could also replace Casemiro when he wasn't available, giving backup in those two spots. And then further up the field, we've got Fernandes, who's playing in the role that Mount suits best. And as we can see, there's only one game where he wasn't available to start for Manchester United in the Premier League. Rashford as well, playing in the wide left berth, is also playing in a position that Mason Mount could feasibly play in. And this is very unusual for Rashford because he barely picked up any injuries through the course of the season. And this is another spot where Mount could have been expected to fill in. And so if the problem that Manchester United are trying to solve is backup for these players, then it may look as though they found the wrong solution. But it's important to note that actually Anthony Martial, who was the number 9 for Manchester United last season, was barely available at all. And that meant that Rashford then had to play as a 9 for a lot of the season as well. And also Anthony on the other side, lots of unavailability from him, and in those situations, Bruno Fernandes could move into that wide right berth, leaving the 10 spot open as well. And so by bringing in Mason Mount, Manchester United now have starting level quality in the centre midfield area, in the 10 spot, and then either side in the wide forward areas as well. And if you need proof that he can play on either side, well, we've got his touch maps from the last couple of seasons, and as we can see last season, he had a tendency to move over to the left-hand side and pick the ball up in those wide areas, and then the season before actually has that tendency, but on the right-hand side as well. Also worth noting that he likes to pick the ball up in those half spaces as well, which is exactly where you would want him to pick the ball up in those centre midfield positions. But in terms of Mason Mount's flexibility, we've only talked about the in-possession stuff, and that is only one part of his game. So if we go back to our article from Laurie Whitwell and Tom Harris, we see this line: 5 years on, Ten Hag wants to bring Mount to Old Trafford because of his technique on the ball, but also importantly his application off it. He is seen at United as a modern midfielder capable of carrying out specific tactical instructions and leading the press, a key component of Erik Ten Hag's approach. And this shows up really nicely in the data, because if we look at Manchester United's PPDA over time, we can see that their pressing intensity has gone up under Erik Ten Hag. It's a really important part of his game because he wants to control the opposition not only in possession but out of possession and force them to do things that make their life harder. And the important phrase from the previous quote was leading the press. Now what this means is that Mason Mount is a player who is actually not only going to be good in terms of what he does out of possession, but he's also a smart, intelligent player who will be able to read triggers well, be able to read the opposition's movement and actually start those pressing moments for Manchester United. So the big question is, what do Manchester United look like when they press? So on the board in front of me here, I've got Manchester United as if they're playing against a back 4 with a midfield 3. And the big idea is that they want to go player for player when the opposition are trying to build up to make it as hard as possible for them to do that. Now, you may notice that Manchester United have a front 3, and if they're playing against a back 4, you've got a mismatch in numbers here. So what usually happens is when the ball goes one side, Manchester United are going to go player for player along the line here, like this, leaving a spare man on the far side. And the idea is that by pressing really aggressively, player for player, it will be hard for the opposition to find that weakness on the other side. So they're going to force one way and then make it really hard for them to go the other way. Now, obviously, this is going to happen the same way on the other side. If the ball comes in here, you're going to see them move across this way. But what it means is that in the front line of the press, you have 2 between players, as I like to call them. So we've got Anthony here, and his job is to either move on to the centre-back or the full-back, depending on when the ball is. And the same is true for Marcus Rashford on the other side. And that means that these players actually have to have a really good reading of the press, because if you get it wrong and you push on the centre back when the ball's on this side, it can be the case that the opposition is just going to play around your press really easily. So if Mason Mount is going to play in one of these wide positions, he is going to have the smarts to be able to make these kinds of decisions in real time. Do I step up on the centre back, or do I move wide onto the full back? And then in the central midfield area, Manchester United tend to go player for player, and so what you end up with when you're playing against a 3-man midfield is just matching up in the midfield area. And there's a degree of flexibility here, so the opposition here playing with 2 8s, and so so Eriksen can just drop in and keep this player occupied. If this midfielder is being used as a double pivot, then Eriksen will just step up with him as well. So it gives you a certain amount of flexibility. You make sure that the opposition player is never free. And so given that he'll be doing a lot of man marking, Mason Mount will be excellent in both of these spots, either if he's replacing Eriksen or Fernandes. He's really mobile, and that's super important when you're playing in these one-to-one scenarios. But that is Manchester United pressing up against a back four where the structure matches really nicely with theirs. But what about when Manchester United are pressing up against a back three where the opposition are essentially taking a player from elsewhere on the pitch and dropping them into the first line of their build-up, because that is going to change the matchups all the way across the field. Now this actually happened in the game against Spurs from before the World Cup. Now Spurs obviously have a back three, and what they were doing is they were pushing the centre-back to the left-hand side and pushing Ben Davies further up the field, allowing the wing-back on this side to get further forward. Now this may look like a situational back four, but Spurs actually do now have an extra player in the build-up phase which causes problems for Manchester United, and on top of that, Manchester United are hyper aware of the fact that Harry Kane is in this position, so they want Casemiro to have a fairly free role so that he can shield passes into Kane's feet, who's going to drop in here. So Casemiro, they want you to try and keep as free as possible, and that means that now you have players for Manchester United who have a responsibility to cover a couple of players depending on where the ball is. So let's imagine that the ball is with this centre-back. What we would see is Martial pushing across here, and Rashford's going to cover here, much like they would in their normal press. And now Antony is going to cover Ben Davies, the outside centre-back here. Now Manchester United have a couple of decisions to make here, because now we have a free player here in the pivot and a free player here potentially. And there's a couple of options of what they can do. You can either have Fernandes coming across and then have Eriksen jumping. This does leave the most advanced midfielder free, but as we've said, Casemiro is now patrolling this area zonally, so that's all fine. But there are going to be certain situations where Fernandes is across on this player, Eriksen is on the most advanced midfielder, and the only option then is to push Casemiro up, and again you're leaving then this space open to be exploited potentially. And the difference between whether Manchester United go with this option or the previous one is just down to the player's sense of what is the most dangerous thing in the moment, which is why you need intelligent pressers. And just to show you what happens when Spurs build up on the other side, let's imagine that the ball goes to this centre-back. Now Martial is going to press on that centre-back, Rashford is able to cover the other wing-back, Fernandes is going to get the ball-sided centre midfielder, and in this situation Antony is now going to drop in to that central midfielder to make sure that they're covered. And again, you're leaving three players on the opposite side to the side the ball is on, but the idea is that if you're really aggressive in your pressing, it will be impossible for the opposition to be able to find those weaknesses through passing. So as we can see, when Manchester United are pressing up against a back three, we can see that they require their players to do a huge amount of decision making. They have to decide which player they should press up on, whether or not they should leave their marker and move on to another player, and that is why Mason Mount will be so good for Erik ten Hag, because he is one of the players who is really good at that side of the game. And one final thing on the out of possession side of the game, one thing that Manchester United have been really good at this season is winning the ball high up the field and then generating chances from it. So this is a viz which shows Manchester United's possession regains in the attacking third. So this is all the times where they've won the ball back from the opponent and then been able to generate chances from them. So every empty circle is a turnover in the final third, and every yellow dot is a turnover which has resulted in a shot being taken. So it's clear that Manchester United are getting a huge amount of attacking upside from their aggressive press. But the eagle-eyed amongst you will have noticed that there is only one of these chances which resulted in a goal, which is not a huge rate of return. And that is another area where Mason Mount could be really dangerous for this team, because not only is he really good in terms of winning the ball back in the final third, he's also really good at converting those chances as well. And I've just got an example from a game a couple of seasons back against Leicester. This is Leicester trying to build up from the back. Here's Mason Mount playing as a 10, and as we can see, he's quite a distance away from Ndidi, who's playing as the pivot for the opposition player. Now the ball is going to end up at the feet of Ndidi, and Mason Mount is able to cover that distance really quickly, win the ball back from him, and actually ends up scoring. And I did want to show you the moment where he kicks the ball, because as you can see, this is really remarkable that he's able to get his body into a position where he can even get this shot away. So it requires a certain amount of athleticism. And it's important to note that when you are winning the ball high up in the opposition's third, then often you're going to have these situations where you have to be able to take snapshots in order to convert those turnovers into goals, and Mason Mount can clearly do that as well. So again, here's another area where he's offering upside to Manchester United. £60 million is a lot of money for a player, especially when he isn't a perfect replacement for any one player in your squad. But Manchester United haven't brought Mason Mount in to be a replacement player. They brought him in to offer starting level quality across 4 different positions. And for a team like Manchester United, who fell away at the end of last season because of injury, Mason Mount could be the difference that keeps them competitive all the way through the season.
If you like this video, please consider subscribing to the channel. The Athletic is home to some of the world's best sports journalists, including journalists dedicated to each Premier League team, so every fan gets the coverage they deserve, not just the big clubs. And you can try it for free now for 30 days. See the link in the description.